Mute the microphones.
Looks like we're ready with the screen, with the zooming.
Okay. All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for being here. This is our first ever roundtable. Really excited for this opportunity to have a little bit less formal dialogue and some good exchanges with each other. Do we have people joining us on Zoom? Do we have members? Ian Schmidt. Morgan, okay. Great. So I think what we'll do is we can go around and introduce ourselves, even though we have name tags, just to start to get a little bit acquainted with each other. So please, when it's your turn, introduce yourself, which committee or commission you're representing, and your preferred pronouns, please. So I'm Jenna Goodman Campbell. I'm the mayor. This is June. Use she, her pronouns.
Anthony Broadman, he, him.
Megan Perkins, she, her.
Steven Seagal, he, him.
Joanne Mina with the Human Rights and Equity Commission, she, her, hers.
Nicholas Rayden with the City of Bend's Accessibility Advisory Committee, and he, him, his.
Diane Farrington, she, her, and I'm gonna look at my own title. I've heard so many versions.
I'm Barb Campbell and I serve on City Council and I use she, her pronouns.
Melanie Keebler, she and her.
Eric King, Ben City Manager, he, him.
Great. And then could we have the people on Zoom, if they are panelists, unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please.
They don't look like they're in the Zoom yet.
I don't believe my audio's on.
Oh, yes, here's somebody.
Great. So this is Ian Schmidt representing the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee. Ian Schmidt and I use he and him.
Thank you, Ian. And Morgan. Morgan, can you unmute yourself?
I don't see her box over there, so I'm just.
Wow, we have Morgan Schmidt joining us from the Neighborhood Leadership Alliance.
There we go. Now I have the power to unmute myself. Sorry for this. This is Morgan Schmidt, she, her pronouns, and I'm joining as the chair of the NLA.
Thank you, Morgan.
Any way we can turn that?
Yeah.
Yes, I think.
In any way we can see them?
Once we stop sharing the screen, we have just a brief presentation, I think.
Okay.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Shelley. Okay, so we'll dive in with some introductory kind of presentation now. First, I'll just go over kind of some ground rules. I'm borrowing from the Human Rights and Equity Commission ground rules, so I'm not going to read them all, but Joanne would be very familiar with these, I would think, at this point. Oh yeah, and Stephen and Mo. Our goal here is to be inclusive and conduct this meeting in such a way that everybody has the opportunity to contribute. We really want to hear from you all who've taken your time to join us tonight and give us feedback on this code. The most obvious one is that we'll take turns speaking. Please don't speak over each other or interrupt, and allow somebody time to finish the thought. Also, as the facilitator, Anthony and I will allow for a brief pause, or we'll try to allow for a brief pause after everybody comments, in case there's somebody who wants to respond. And then if that moment passes, then we'll kind of move on in the discussion. But I want to make sure that people have a moment to collect their thoughts and respond to somebody else if they wish to. Also, we should try to use welcoming and inclusive language as much as possible. And when we hear language that is not welcoming and inclusive, you can kind of raise your hand or just indicate, that you'd like to make a comment when that other person is done. Try to respectfully kind of explain what was problematic about the language that was used. We also want to be respectful of different viewpoints and experiences of each other, and hope that everybody can bring kind of their genuine thoughts and experiences to this meeting. Another one that I really like is the acronym WAIT. So for those of us who tend to talk a lot in meetings, you can maybe ask yourself, why am I talking? Why am I talking so much? And if you're not somebody who tends to speak up right away, then ask yourself, why aren't I talking? And challenge yourself to, if you usually tend toward one or the other, make sure to be kind of mindful of how much space you're taking up with your comments. Hope that everybody will participate actively this evening in the discussion. It's a pretty small group, and so I expect that we should be able to do that really well. And I think I'll probably, ask, I like this one, ask questions to receive clarification before assuming someone's intent, or pausing to evaluate the impact of the statement or action. So I think for all of us, especially on council, approaching this process and the feedback we're going to receive tonight with curiosity, but I think for everybody, kind of keeping that word curiosity in mind as we go through the discussion of rather than something might trigger you to feel a little bit defensive, and instead asking a clarifying question is a great way, I think, to respond. So with that, I think I'll pass it over to Anthony to give us a little kind of introduction and overview of what brings us to this moment in this discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Mayor, and thank you everybody for coming, especially giving up your evening for this important work. We really appreciate it. And thank you, Shelley and Claire and Brenna and Juan, for this is a very exciting, I think, use of our new rules, the Roundtable. I'm excited to use this in the future and excited that we're embarking on our first attempt at it tonight. So thank you for being part of the first voyage of this new tool that we have under our rules. For today's meeting, we're going to spend the majority of our time hearing feedback from the invited folks on the draft code. And you all have the draft code. I know council has all looked at it. It reflects input and policy concepts that we've provided to staff in terms of drafting. We don't have time tonight for general public comment, but I don't want anybody to misapprehend that that's limiting input or comment in any way. In fact, I think our request from council is that people continue to give us as much comment and input on this important initiative and all important initiatives that council works on at any general meeting or at any agenda item for council. We'll have public hearings on this code later this fall, assuming we move forward, likely in October or November, before we take any action or vote on this code in any way. So this is an important step, but by no means the ultimate step or penultimate step in creating this code. Folks who are watching, please, continue to provide us emails by emailing council@bendoregon.gov. And you can also look for progress. We have a website, bendoregon.gov/camping-code, for all the details in this process. So, of course, we hope you've had a chance to review the code, but do not hesitate to ask questions about practical operation. Even if we can't answer those questions, I think those are great, items for council to have before us. So in order to provide some context for our discussion, we're going to provide an overview of the city's strategies and investments within the houselessness effort to date, as well as how we got to this point in this legislative process. We'll then move to the discussion and wrap up with what's next for code development with council with what's currently planned. So I want to ground us a little bit in some of the work that council has already done supporting houselessness solutions. It's important to recognize the city's responsibility as a municipality as it relates to our options for supporting the solutions that we know we all need in our community. So this graphic is intended to provide context of how and where we can do this work and where we are frankly quite limited in using the resources we have to address what is a community, regional, state, and national houselessness crisis. So at the top of this diagram, you see policy and code. Examples of that would be the council's safe parking code. Also, our administrative approach right now to managing the right-of-way and development code changes like we made with regard to where shelters can be sited in the city of Bend. Turning clockwise to infrastructure and capital investments. One very critical goal that this council, ambitious goal that this council has set forth, is to enable the creation of 500 shelter beds. Examples of what we've done in that space, of course, are the motel acquisitions, Project Turnkey, the Rainbow Motel, also the Second Street Shelter and the Lighthouse Navigation Center. In terms of funding opportunities at the bottom of this diagram, we've been blessed in some ways with amounts that the city has been allocated under the American Rescue Plan Act, and also by way of ARPA funds that we received from the state government. Those allow for pass-through to nonprofits who are the folks who are really professionally trained and skilled at direct services to the unhoused community. Examples of that would be the Navigation Center operational funds and ARPA funding for community service providers. And then finally, regional partnerships. And so glad to have Executive Director Cheyenne Purrington here with us tonight. Your presence is really welcome and exactly, I think, what this council envisioned when we set forward on the CHRO. So, in addition to that collaborative houselessness resource office, we see opportunities for other partnerships with the public health authority for the city, and that is Deschutes County. We're not going to be able to make meaningful strides in this space without our partners, and that's not just the county, that's all governments who share an obligation to the people living in the city. But these regional partnerships, whether it's with COIC or Park and Rec or library or schools or Forest Service, really allow us, we hope, to have a broader reach with innovative programs and leveraging what are extremely limited city resources. So in terms of the city's strategy and investments, we have invested local, state, and federal funding to increase the number of shelter beds in Bend. We support service provider operations and address camping and city right-of-ways. But again, it's important to note that Deschutes County provides public health and behavioral health services, and the city of Bend and Deschutes County at this moment, I think, as exemplified by your presence, Cheyenne, are working together to address houselessness. Deschutes County and the cities of Bend, Lapine, Redmond, and Sisters are the recipients of $1 million in state funding to establish the CHRO to help streamline the work of dozens of local organizations serving our regional houseless population. And this will, I'm confident, enable a community-wide approach under a shared set of principles, priorities, strategies, and this unified structure is, again, I believe, and I think we all believe, the best tool to equip community stakeholders to engage and support these countywide efforts. As the city leverages these funding opportunities, I want to highlight the Biennium funding for shelters and other houselessness initiatives, which total almost $20 million. Shelter acquisition and renovation of $13 million, shelter operations of $3.8 million, a temporary outdoor shelter of $1.7 million, and right-of-way cleanup and other efforts totaling $500,000. Very specifically, when it comes to current city projects and programs, I want to highlight specific examples of how we have worked to fulfill that mission, how we have implemented the strategy that we've set forth. We started almost 2 years ago with changes in our municipal code. Those changes were critical to form a really important solution for our community in the safe parking program. We made significant investments in infrastructure and capital projects, including the purchase of several properties that leverage state and federal funding opportunities. And we built on the concept of a continuum of housing options. We've contracted with Central Oregon Villages as recently as this week to complete phase 1 for a temporary outdoor shelter. And that's going to create 20 temporary shelter beds. Undertaking the shelter code amendments within our development code provided the option for various types of shelters to be built in most zoning districts. It has been a busy and focused time for council. I think anybody who participated in the shelter code process saw how hard council and this community stepped up to work on making sure that those shelter code amendments reflected our commitment to making sure that everybody in this community has a safe place to be. So now this leads us to the important work of creating clarity and well thought, safe regulation about where camping occurs on city right of ways. So creating the camping code, let's just take a little bit of a look back. We had the administrative policies over the last few years about guiding the city's role in the right of way. But what was clear, I think, through that administrative policy and the use of that policy was that the community, the housed community, the unhoused community needs more clarity and direction related to camping in our city. Community members have asked, why are we doing this now? And I think that's a really important question. There's still a lack of capacity in shelter beds. I know that this is not a standalone process, and that's why I started with the history. It's part of a multitude of strategies and part of the city's obligation to regulate public space in the city limits. We can't pull out regulation of right-of-way from the context of the larger work we're doing on this larger puzzle. Our entire community, sheltered and unsheltered, need clarity on regulations on how we are all going to use public space. It is not the city's public space. It is not the housed community's public space. It is not the unhoused community's public space. It is all of our public space, and we need to regulate it effectively. We've created over the years a patchwork of administrative policies that address certain situations. This policy in one place is intended to give clarity and a single place for everybody in the community to look, to know and order their affairs around. And I believe we want a community where everyone has safety, everybody knows where to go to get support, and where to get the resources they need if they want to change their situation. I think it's also important to note that the majority of cities around the West have camping codes. Those are all cities that are subjected to the same Ninth Circuit jurisprudence that we all are. All of the cities in the Ninth Circuit and throughout the West have to have provisions related to camping when shelters are not available. And the sheltered and unsheltered community members, businesses, community groups, public agencies, we believe are all asking for this clarity and direction from city leaders on this important issue. So that's why we're here. And again, I just want to express my gratitude to everybody for doing this heavy lifting with us and stepping up and being part of your community. I know it's not easy, but we appreciate it. So I think.
Excuse me.
No.
Just the child transfer.
So I think I'll turn to the quick overview of the code. And I think that's probably the best.
Thank you.
For bearing with us, everybody, on the information.
Yeah. Good evening, everybody. Ian Lighthizer from the City Attorney's Office. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly in the interest of letting all of you have dialogue, and then I'll be available if questions do come up as you discuss.
Zoom people again.
The upside is, although there's a delay getting the slides back up, there aren't very many of them I'll be going through.
In the
There's, in the interest of time, in front of you is a hard copy. You just want to talk through it.
Yeah, I can do it, and I'll not even use the slide. So what the code would do is it would create a new section in, a new chapter in Title 3 of our code. That's the title of the code that already exists that covers public rights of way and city property. What the proposed code would do is create a new chapter that regulates how this space is used for camping. I recognize camping may or may not be the best term for this, but that's what we're using now. So there are 6 sections in the proposed code. The first section defines some terms. It defines camping as an activity. It defines things like camp materials and a few other terms we thought were important. The most important thing I think that you have in the definitions section is a definition of available with regard to what it means to have shelter available to a particular person. That's important because the next section of the code includes a general prohibition on camping in public rights of way and city property that can only be enforced by citation when someone has, when someone does have shelter available to them. And the way that the enforcement mechanics would work is outlined in the 3rd new code section. That is the code section that requires an individualized assessment of shelter availability with regard to a particular person before they could potentially be cited for violating the camping prohibition. 4th section of the code contains the time, place, and manner regulations that council has provided input on over the last month or two. Those rules are what would govern use of public right-of-way and city property for camping for those people for whom shelter is not available. In other words, where a citation wasn't appropriate because somebody didn't have any place else to go and was forced to use public places for sleeping or shelter, that 4th section of the code would establish some rules and guidelines for when, where, and how that can happen. We then have a distinct section of the code dealing with vehicles. It relies in part on existing parking code, requires that vehicles must be legally parked and that people using vehicles for sleeping or shelter adhere to certain rules to mitigate the impacts that somehow go along with that activity. Finally, the last section of the proposed code is a section on violations. And that really outlines how enforcement personnel would deal with violations, potentially through citations where appropriate, or potentially through removal of campsites where appropriate. And that process is governed by state law, which sets some procedural and other requirements for removal of campsites from public properties. And those would all be essentially incorporated into that section of the code. So that's the overview.
So I also forgot to mention that as we discuss all the feedback we've heard tonight and on our next roundtable on Thursday, which we have a number of groups joining us, then the next step will be to take all the feedback and direction we've heard through these meetings at our council meeting next Wednesday on the 5th, and kind of discuss the next steps and where we want to go from there. And we're not going to have any formal vote or decision in tonight's meeting. It's just for discussion, feedback. Oh, yes, thank you. And also, before we kind of dive into discussion, I I wanted to note and thank Joanne, especially as a member of the Human Rights Commission and co-chair or vice chair, but the entire Human Rights and Equity Commission for the recommendation that you all provided for us for your kind of official recommendation to council that has already resulted in a really large kind of increase in our efforts to gain feedback from people with lived experience, kind of directly engaging that feedback. So that outreach is going on right now. We have a set of questions that service providers have been given to ask people who they work with if they're willing to provide their feedback for us. So we will be receiving that feedback at our October 5th meeting. Is that correct as well?
On Thursday.
Oh, great. Earlier than I expected. So yeah, I just wanted to thank the entire Human Rights and Equity Commission again for that. It's resulted in, I think, a lot more in-depth feedback than we otherwise would have gotten, and more direct from the individuals who we need to hear from. And then also, we've already heard Cheyenne introduce herself, but just want to acknowledge you and thank you for being here, and really look forward to hearing your thoughts as well. So I guess before we really dive into discussion, does anybody have any questions about kind of all of the information that we just walked through?
You want to go first? Me? I had a pretty quick question. I'm just curious, did we hear back from our other advisory bodies? Were they just not able to find, folks to attend?
Well, we have Ian and Scott.
Yes.
Scott, have you heard Scott? I thought Scott Winters with the Planning Commission.
Yeah, they said they would be here, but they're not.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Okay.
we're hoping that maybe he's just
Great. Yeah, no, it's tight after business hours if people had to go to work yet. Great. Okay, thank
He's the
you.
only person I see that we're missing.
Oh,
Neil-
okay.
Neil's not
Neil-
here,
Neil-
yeah.
Neil online.
B-Dub's not here.
Okay,
B-Dub couldn't find to be able to make it tonight.
got it. All right. Okay, thank you. Go ahead, Joanne. Sorry.
I want to follow up on Barb's and the business development.
Yes.
Isn't that another committee that should
Yeah,
be?
they weren't able to find someone to be here, but Ben is here sort of as the staff person for B-Dub.
I'll be asking them to find this, and you'll be hearing from the BCDPA.
Can we not speak in acronyms just for the sake of the community? Because and for myself,
Yes.
it's all good. Yeah.
Central District Business Association.
Thank you.
They've been working pretty closely with them, and I think
And they'll be here on Thursday. Is that right?
The business community will be here Thursday.
From the Central District specific.
Well, in the chamber.
The chamber and then the downtown business. Part of our business kind of roundtable is we structured that second roundtable.
So my question regarding the presentation was, council sort of approach the attorneys here at the city to kind of give some guidance into something, right? To bounce back ideas and reflect. My question is, what was the value that was driving that request? And from each one of you, if you want to share, what was the value that was the grounding stone for having that request to the attorneys at the city?
So to clarify, you kind of mean like what was the value underlying kind of initiating the process to work on the code? Mm-hmm.
I believe the community needs clarity. Most people, in my humble opinion, think that we have a camping code and that we're just not enforcing it. And that is causing a whole lot of upset. People feeling like we're just not even enforcing the laws, feeling like, just unsafe. And then also from the perspective of people who are unhoused, it's kind of that same concern from the other perspective, not knowing if they're in a spot that is legal, not knowing if someone is liable, honestly, to wake them up in the middle of the night and make them move, not knowing if they themselves or their possessions are safe. And for me, I'm trying to put information into that vacuum that exists right now and actually get the code in the books and then have a clear path toward enforcement or a clear explanation for why the code is not being enforced at this time.
Thank you, Barb. Yeah, clarity is kindness.
Yeah.
Anybody else that would like?
I
to-
agree with what Barb said. I share a lot of those
And,
views.
and I just want to say, sorry, I didn't want to interrupt, but I saw Megan say, going like this.
No, I was.
Oh, sorry. So I just wanted to like, everybody has different values. So if don't think that Barb's, answer, like she doesn't speak for everybody, and I'm sure, and you'll have your own things that move you. Sorry.
Yeah, so I agree with what Barb said, and I also think there is value in having the council work through this as an actual policy that's in our code and is not an administrative policy that can be adjusted by the city manager that sort of lives in this weird quasi not really code, more of a policy. I think this is something that it's our responsibility to move forward with as a council to put in our code. If we, for the reasons Barb said, want to move forward with it and not just let it keep being in this sort of limbo space. So that's important to me.
So if I understood correctly, like the core value was like accountability, responsibility to take that on.
Right, for that we move through that process. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, the word that came to mind for me was clarity. I think, yeah, leadership needs to be clear on kind of like what the rules are and expectations are for the community. But that's not to say that I was clear on that I am clear on what exactly the result should be. But clarity in that we needed to have the discussion.
Yeah, I think I probably come at it from relatively the same place. I think we have an obligation to legislate when it comes to public space. So the value that I think undergirds my hope that we move forward with something is this is our legislative obligation to effectively regulate public space so that we're regulating our collective public space equitably and fairly in a clear way. And I'm continue to be, not to suggest that past councils did something wrong, but I'm surprised that we've had this regulatory gap for as long as we've had. Not just for unhoused people or people who are camping because they don't have a place to go, but because there are other people who have houses and decide to camp. It seems to be a vacuum that I'm surprised continues to exist in what is otherwise an extremely well-regulated city, where if we do not regulate our finite resources, including public space, that we risk not treating people fairly. So I guess duty would be to sum that up. It's an obligation.
Thank you.
And yeah, I agree with what everyone said. I think the way that I've tried to look at it, Joanne, is that this is one piece of a much larger picture for us. And this is the piece that doesn't feel very value driven, if that makes sense, compared to all of the other things that we are doing for our houseless community. It feels more like it is an obligation. Feel like writing something that right now, it doesn't seem to be working. It's cumbersome. There aren't a clear set of sort of, rules and expectations. People don't understand, when a camp is unsafe and when it's not. And so I think, the idea behind clarity and just all the public sort of coming to a mutual understanding about our public rights of way. Yeah, that's how I'm looking at it.
Thank you. Could I ask a follow-up question? you mentioned feeling like an obligation. And I know there is a lot of burden that have been put on you all. If you think of what value drives that obligation, what would you say it is?
I mean, I think we have an obligation as city councilors to provide this leadership. And I also think that we have an obligation to our business community. We have an obligation to our neighbors, and we have, most importantly, an obligation to our houseless community.
Thank you.
Well, I've just got onto council in June, so I will say that a lot of, I don't disagree with anyone else, what they've said so far. But to be honest, I was kind of thrusted into this, right? With a little bit of time to kind of figure out where I was at. So a lot of it's just me listening to the community and trying to figure out what they need. And that goes for the houseless community, that goes for the BIPOC community, that goes for the business community, that goes for everybody. So really, I don't really have much more to add because I wasn't asking for this. This is something that's been asked of me now. And so my job is to represent the people of the city of Bend.
Thank you.
Of course.
Joanna, I really appreciate your very direct and clear question. I would say that the value that's driving sort of this for me around the discussion or having the conversation is different than some of my colleagues. Because I have similar here to Stephen, I'm new. But I would say my hope and my value is that we can create policy and leadership and take on responsibility from a lens not that of dominant culture. Because if we were able to do it that way, I think, in fact, I know it would take longer, but my sense is that it would reduce harm. And my hope is that it would create more of a collective consciousness in our community around like what it really does mean to be good neighbors, not just like as this like intellectual thought or meme around being good neighbors, but actually having the courage to engage in this process, but pause and try to ask ourselves from a value of operating from a lens that's not oriented around dominant culture to answer some of these really difficult questions in our culture and society around poverty and trauma and suffering and how we as a community look at it.
Thank you. So if I understood correctly,
Yeah.
you also feel a sense of responsibility, but kind of gear with intent towards people that have been historically excluded.
Yes, the responsibility is more just, I put my name in the hat. I said, sure, I'll be in the hot seat. I'll be on city council if you'll have me. And so some of the responsibility is like, I'm here and I chose to be in a leadership position. And part of being a leader is being in the hot seat and having uncomfortable and difficult conversations and getting feedback and making mistakes and so that's sort of what I mean around responsibility and just the responsibility of like, how do we as like Bend actually has an opportunity. I think as a council, we have an opportunity to like really be leaders in this around like flipping the script and deconstructing some things and being really uncomfortable and viewing this policy from a different lens that we've all been socialized to think about it in one way because we have, and to try to do it differently. That's my value in this, is I'd really like to try to do this differently as a community.
Thank you. You all want to know my value? I would love to hear everybody else's value. Mine is justice. When there is injustice, justice calls me to be there and stand behind. But yeah, thank you.
Anybody have any other questions about kind of the background information? Or we can dive into kind of looking section by section at the code itself and questions around that. I think unless anybody has any kind of general reflection that they want to provide, in a whole on the draft, diving into the sections could help just kind of us organize our discussion a little bit. So looking at the code and sections, I'm curious what questions or comments, feedback people have on, we'll start with the definitions section. And I will also acknowledge that this is in code language. This is in legal language. So, while it's tempting to wordsmith, we know that we need to put this into kind of human language. And that will be, a step that is taken. But happy to hear questions or comments or feedback on the definition section.
This is Morgan on the screen. Sorry, I don't know how to interact from a distance. I just want to share that we all know, and this is no fault of anybody's, but there just wasn't a ton of time for NLA reps to get a lot of feedback from their NAs on these topics. So I have a couple of points of feedback throughout this process, but representing the NLA tonight as their new chair, I'm here to listen and chime in occasionally with the limited feedback I was able to receive.
Morgan.
Thanks.
This is Nicholas Rayden with the City of Bend Accessibility Advisory Committee. I just had some questions about the definitions and if accessibility or disabilities were further defined in that section or not, or if they're further defined elsewhere within the code.
I can answer that maybe. No, accessibility isn't defined in the code. Disabilities aren't defined in the code. There is a provision in the section on enforcement that I think refers to ADA disabilities. So I think anytime we see disability in a code like this, we're going to rely on ADA definitions and concepts. Not that it couldn't be further defined, but ADA is referenced in the code. And I think the default for assessing what that means is going to be relying on the ADA, either regulations or cases. I think there was another question too. Was it accessibility?
Accessibility and disabilities.
Yes. Yeah. So for disabilities, those are my thoughts on disabilities. For accessibility, no, we don't have a particular definition in these draft provisions. We do have, and this is somewhat related, we have a definition of what accessible path or accessible passage means in a different section of the code that has to do with regulating and really prohibiting obstructions of our public rights of way that eliminate an accessible path, and that's considered something at least 6 feet in width under the code. So that's defined elsewhere, but not in this particular chapter.
Well, it's referenced, right, Ian?
It is. That section is referenced in the code. Yeah.
Reference to that.
Yep.
Accessible definition. Okay.
And I think it's key to the concept, which I know council has given policy direction in terms of whether shelter is available, which is one of the first layers of when this is taking into account reasonable accommodation when we're making, whether it's a social worker, a non-sworn officer agent of the city who's making the first outreach, or police who are enforcing. We need to have that accessibility, disability, reasonable accommodation analysis at the very front end. And I think that's built into the question of whether shelter is available to a particular individual.
Under available.
It is. So one of the provisions in the shelter availability definition, and that is in section 1, one of the questions that would need to be asked is whether a shelter can reasonably accommodate a person's mental or physical needs, including but not limited to any disabilities. So it's at least arguably broader than a strict definition of disability and more widely encompassing. And let me say this too. Although the code doesn't say it, and most city codes don't necessarily say it, the city always has a Title II obligation to make its program services and opportunities available to people with disabilities. So that's an overriding obligation, regardless of whether our code says it. And that can result in the need to modify programs, including potentially enforcement, or take other steps to accommodate people who have disabilities who need to access those programs and services. So that is always built in, regardless of whether our code says it or not.
Nick, how do you feel about that answer? What's your hit on that?
My initial reaction is that anywhere between 40 to 60% of the houseless population is disabled in some form, and that's of what's been surveyed out there. And so that target, that percentage, it could actually be higher. In women, it's actually potentially much higher than that, 70% in some studies. So just through that lens of disability, it's a pretty prime component with the shelter code and also with the camping code.
I'm glad you said that. I think, if we were to step back, this feels like a difficult conversation because it should be. We are talking about people's lives. We're talking about people with disabilities who have huge amounts of vulnerability, not just one vulnerability, but many. And this feels like trying to take more resources from people. So just understanding that discomfort, I think you kind of mentioned it, it should feel uncomfortable. I think there's some ways that we can situate this code, which I understand the burden on the council to have one, in a larger encampment resolution strategy that separates this idea of enforcement from service. The biggest concern, and I realize this isn't specifically about definitions, the biggest concern that I have around this is that there's this uncomfortable entanglement between enforcement personnel, which is a very big term, and offering of services. And that entanglement goes against what I consider best practices, which is that services are voluntary. My general recommendation would be that you consider removing this idea of shelter availability. There simply is not enough shelter. The idea of someone knocking on a tent, and I'm playing this out so that we understand that this is going to be a practice. Someone with a gun knocking on a tent. Tell me all your disabilities. Yeah. Stepping away to make calls to shelters, to staff who are overburdened, to see if there's a bed across town. It is not only impractical, it is not the right path. So the idea of spending a lot of time navigating down a path that feels uncomfortable on purpose, it's not, this shouldn't feel comfortable. I would encourage taking that portion out until the city feels comfortable that there is sufficient shelter. There's just not. We know that there's probably 1,000 folks on our streets who do not have nearly that number of beds. If there are vacancies, they're probably being filled each night by competent staff doing this work. And I realize that's sort of a way to start the conversation, but I don't want to do a lot of wordsmithing with something that feels so uncomfortable for good reason. Take a step back, get out of this procedural piece where an officer is expected to do service work. That's not reasonable.
And we've been kind of putting off that enforcement discussion because it's somewhat of an implementation step, but right.
Because it takes policy into procedure and it tells service staff how to do their work and it puts them in a position of enforcing. For someone who is already vulnerable, who may be disabled, who has a high likelihood of co-occurring disorders, who needs care, that is not going to be the way that they voluntarily say yes to going to a shelter that may or may not be a safe space for them.
So to be clear, the feedback that is that removing this camping prohibited section and then
for available shelter. It's a reference to Martin v. Boise. I think it's worth calling that out. It is dysfunctional in every community I've seen it. It doesn't work. So why create a complexity for staff level, officers, service workers. And also, if you're expecting that it's not officers and it's not city staff, then you're signing service workers up unfunded to do that work, to be enforcers. And at this point, it's not a fully funded program. I think the best practice and resolution, send, maybe have a citation, then services staff out with funding. The city can support nonprofits to do that work, completely voluntary and private conversations around needs, and over time engaging that person to secure the shelter that's comfortable for them. There's a lot of shelters that are not safe. There's a lot of reasons someone might not want to go across town if they work on this side of town and can't get back. So this idea of removing someone and relocating them, it's just dysfunctional. It doesn't actually end up happening. So why create a procedure that's not going to actually happen? Are some thoughts? And I'm happy to have uncomfortable conversations. I think good policy comes from some friction and some conflict. So if someone disagrees, I'm not trying to be a loud voice. I am just offering perspective.
Well, it's important to know about other cities, right? And I think we know that other cities have camping codes, but we don't know, right, how it's, how to.
I will say that the communities that I've seen with camping codes that do enforce them use them as a tool to criminalize people who are already vulnerable. And it doesn't solve the problem. It creates fear, anxiety, it re-traumatizes people. It's a waste of city resources. And it actually, what it does is it pushes people from a community to another. And that creates the regional issue of large encampments that we're seeing. And we're trying to get out of that cycle.
My question was around terms and definitions that are missing. The Human Rights and Equity Commission encouraged council to see sheltering as a basic human right to be able to survive the elements. That would be some good definition to have in this code. Also, the Human Rights and Equity Commission suggested that council strive to provide safe spaces within city limits so that unhoused people can safely shelter, whether it's a sanctioned shelter or a unsanctioned shelter, whether it's coordinated or whether it is not coordinated, but folks should be able to be at peace somewhere and be able to protect themselves from the elements. So those were like two definitions that would be great to have included in this document.
And I would echo that one of the terms that I would recommend is survival sheltering, because it really is different from what we're describing as camping. Camping really connotes something recreational and sort of fun and optional. Survival sheltering centers this idea that people are trying to survive, and that especially in winter as we approach cold temperatures, is truly what those materials are and what that equipment is, seeking to achieve.
Does that encapsulate kind of the first comment that you were making, Joanne?
Yes. I'm so glad she has some background, fancy words to.
We all are. We've been trying to think of what to say instead of camp for at least 2 years.
Survival sheltering, I think that's it. The other terms that you'll hear often from HUD's perspective, and I use HUD as a reference because it is the federal level of sort of, the flow of funding and the flow of best practices. Terms like not meant or suited or designed or intended for human habitation. And that, none of us should be for encampments in one sense, because they are not really truly designed to support a human's needs. However, given that that is someone's only option, we're talking about survival. And so I think centering that in your policy makes it also effective in terms of this council communicating forward the intent of the policy so that it does not get weaponized in a future sort of council. I think that's an important way to create policy, is that it carries forward with intent attached so that it doesn't get misconstrued and used as. Just wondering if we should go back to Nick, what you were saying when you gave us some statistics and data around, you know, the community. I'm wondering if like there needs to be something more explicit in the language around protection. I don't know. I mean, it's really good to like have us all know that, but I also know like accountability can be a really slippery thing. I'm just wondering if there needs to be something else in there. I'm sort of putting that out there. That's just not lost. I mean, it was helpful, and then we were like all impacted, you know, and so I'm like, okay, like that's a big deal. Those are big numbers. So like, how does it need to be really explicit so that we as a body and a community are held accountable?
From a liability perspective, you could remove a lot of the language that even talks about that and reduce the city's liability significantly.
I'll leave that to the attorney. I'm more just like wanting to make sure people are protected, not like human beings who are in survival.
Yeah.
Not so much the city, to be blunt, like.
Well, I agree. I mean, I think it's balancing both, right? It's like.
I think that moves us to 3.110.010. Prohibited.
Yes.
Someone has background in facilitation.
Because I think that what I'm hearing say, folks, is that we don't want camping prohibited, but there is a need for protecting, what was the word? Survival sheltering, right?
And I think if you talk about what, you know, get out of this language of camping code, but survival sheltering, the idea that someone needs to remove their sheltering equipment at sunrise, which is the coldest time in the morning, you know, that is not conducive to someone's well-being, their health. If they do have disabilities, they may be taking longer to do that. I think when we think about the human experience of someone living unsheltered, and for hopefully most of us, that's not something in our actual lived experience, but for those who do have lived experience, you know, there are so many barriers and boundaries. Code often becomes a prohibitive tool. And obviously, I understand that most counselors are trying to balance that with not creating promotional tools, like come and camp for free in Bend from elsewhere. I understand that's something that's sort of unstated, but there's this mentioning. I hear a lot of in this community reference to Portland and not wanting to create an environment like that, and balancing public safety and public right of way with the need for sheltering. But I think name those things and call them what they are, rather than skirting around this. I think this idea of where can people, you know, to your point around clarity, will a houseless person be able to successfully navigate, or will service providers be able to successfully navigate this and tell someone where they can camp? Is that truly the intent? If that is, do that, you know, and say, here's where you can safely camp, or survival shelter. I'm not sure that that will be achieved in this policy. That's not actually going to be, you know, a goal you can, there's not going to be a Bend map of where to camp.
Well, Cheyenne, I would say that as a community member, I wrote to council and the school board here, not the school board, sorry, the Parks and Rec board, because we have a lot of resources that I and all of us as taxpayers put into places that already have running water, where we can have, you know, basic infrastructure, and they're across the community. But Barb and I didn't get an answer back from Parks and Rec board to be a willing partner in this dialogue of, can we as a whole community, given all the resources that we have, allocate some specific areas where people can have basic infrastructure and feel safe there, so that then we can say, oh, don't do it here, but let me help you get to a place where you will be stable and, you know, be able to have some sense of community too, right? Because it's important.
That is a best practice, and communities should strive for that. So, and our office would support strategies like that. You know, this is not a one tool toolkit. It will require efforts like that from the council, from the county, you know, the nonprofits involved, to be able to step forward and say, this is needed. Clearly, people are doing it by accident. Let's do it with intent.
And luckily, we will have our, fellow kind of elected leaders from, I believe, will we have somebody from the Parks Board? Do we know? We do. Is Deb coming? Okay, yeah. So, we'll have, that's the idea behind having elected leaders at the second roundtable is to have that discussion, or at least to begin it. I don't think we can really fully even begin to dig into it in, whatever 20, 30 minutes we have allotted on Thursday. But I think the intent is to at least initiate those discussions of as collectively community leaders, how can we support? Where are our gaps? How does this, code that we're considering fit into that?
Thank you. And just to add, I think that will help a little bit with the east-west split, because folks are feeling like, oh, all the shelters are being put on the east side and my property is being devaluated and my kids can't, this and that. If we take a whole community approach to respond to this housing crisis, then, my hope is that we all see a responsibility to care for our neighbor, right? To be our neighbor's keeper. And that means that maybe, the parks in our areas that are large can dedicate, half an acre for a small community to have stability.
So as Joanne was kind of leading us back to the camping prohibited section, want to leave some time for discussion around that, because I think it's a pretty big item that we would, be removing. It would kind of change the character of the code. My perspective of kind of why this is in here was it was kind of aspirational of like, our right of way is not set up for people to camp in. And so, but I've been curious about whether saying camping is prohibited and then later saying except for all of these different reasons has the potential to create some confusion. So want to kind of give space for discussion of both those who feel that it's important to keep the camping prohibited provision in. You want to make sure that you're free to kind of explore that a little bit more, and for for this idea of setting that aside until we're confident that there is enough shelter space.
Yes.
I'm just going to give a beat for others who might want to.
I have a question about this then. For how we're all sitting here reading these documents in this code, how does the houseless community get informed of these items and that they are violating this code?
I think that's kind of the open question at this point.
And I think with any code, there's the legal definitions that get in context of our municipal code, but there's implementation and language that's plainer language that's used. So there would be an effort following the code. We haven't developed any of that because the code's still in draft form. We don't know if it's going to hold this form or going to change. So,
I think probably in several different incarnations, no matter what comes out.
Also different languages too.
Wouldn't expect same document to be used for service providers who are sophisticated, tasked with ensuring public health among the people they serve, to look the same as one-page FAQ. I don't think documents suffice. I mean, I think one of the goals of central governance is to have everybody understand exactly what every other government position is. So I hope and expect whatever we do, the county's helping us get that word out.
Yeah, and I think I see it as part of a larger package of, to me, if we're doing this, it has to be able to be followed. If not, what's the point? And what sort of resources can we be providing so that it can be followed? So, okay, here's the new code, but here is also a list of where you can be. Here is a list of, places you can store your things. Here is a list of, like the whole package would be together, not just, here you go, you can't sleep here. Here's this code language.
So the camping prohibited section to me ties directly to the violations section and the Class C civil infraction. So I just wanted to clarify, what is the value that is driving the city to monetize unhousedness and charge people for being unhoused?
So maybe I can start with an answer to that. And this isn't, I don't think a value, it's a function or an aspect of the fact that we're talking about some set of rules in the code, whatever we end up with. And just like all of the other rules in the code regulating all of these spaces and activities, the code says, because it's what we have the authority to do, that a violation of those rules is a civil infraction. And in our code, we have a Class A, Class B, Class C. So that is it is the citation tool that exists. So I don't think it's value driven. I think it's structure.
It's an equation. It looks like if you have a provision, then you gotta have a way to, deal with that.
It's a consequence, and it's the consequence we have. I will say one more quick thought, because I think this kind of goes more to the value aspect of the issue. Is it's early, and this would not be in the code. This is separate from discussions around the code, but I've started a discussion with our new municipal court judge on whether there could or should, and I think we both think there could and should be the possibility of a court program to deal with this kind of issue if somebody is cited and is cited into municipal court for violating some standard of this that's in this code. There has got to be a better way than simply just having a muni court trial to find out if somebody is guilty or not guilty of this kind of code violation. So started talking with the judge, our new judge, about the possibility of an alternate court program that really might, I think, be more value driven rather than more sort of structure driven. We have this structure of penalties in the code that we have to use for civil infractions. And is there something else we could build into a court program if citations for whatever code we end up with ever get there? I don't think that's anybody's hope, but something that was more about values and less about a monetary penalty or a finding that there was a violation. So that discussion is out there too.
Just quickly, because I would love to hear the value, and Eric, maybe you can talk to us about what's the value. But Ian, just to follow up on that comment, have you had conversations with that new judge on how to create processes to have prohibitions and then the follow-up infractions for the opposite to poverty, for folks that are using their second homes and they're not renting them like they're supposed to and whatnot, white collar crimes? Are you having those conversations with the judge as well?
I have not. And one of the reasons that hasn't occurred to me is that those people tend to be motivated by the prospect of paying a fine. So it tends to work. The fact that we have these civil infractions that can result in monetary penalties tend to work and maybe make sense for those people who have the resources to pay them, and alternatives. They can comply with the standards or they don't. In this case, I don't think anybody thinks that a monetary penalty makes sense or is necessarily a deterrent for somebody who doesn't have shelter. So I haven't had those discussions with the court in those contexts.
Okay, so thank you.
Well, and I think it's worth noting, the unsaid part of this, which is that, if someone does receive a series of citations and fines, that creates more barrier for them housing. And if they have, any kind of record same thing. So the recommendation around a homeless court is, I think, a good one. It's a best practice. Communities are using that as a tool rather than a fine to make connections to services. It is tricky because you do want to ensure that services continue to be voluntary and driven by the client rather than driven by some kind of penalty system. But to your point, that, it is not motivating because that is not what, that's not what we're talking about.
Right.
If someone
Yeah.
needs connections.
I have
to
a
care
value
or
to say.
disability accommodations, fine is not helpful, it's actually detrimental.
And if I could just, because I want to address your question. So right now we have code enforcement that does enforce weeds that are fire dangers on private property or abandoned vehicles or health concerns. It's the same system. We rarely ever get to fines. It's just there in the code. And so the whole goal is to just try to get compliance. And we also have really vulnerable community members that are facing code enforcement that they might be in a housed environment, but they are not able, they're in a very survival mode. And we'll work with community organizations to help clean up property. So, there's, even though something is in a code, there's the actual enforcement piece that is not about monetary. That's not our goal. We don't have code enforcement that's funded by, we really separate that out. This is a community resource. It's just there as a backstop in case we cannot get that voluntary compliance.
Yeah, so there is a value here in that I do not want this code to make it so that someone can be arrested for violating it. And we have, there are community members asking, make it a misdemeanor, send them to jail if they do not comply. And so there is some value in saying, I don't want that. So if there is an enforcement mechanism, let's make it the lowest level civil infraction. And then let's look at something like, Ian and Cheyenne were talking about, as if we even get to that point, then how do we work in that context? That's knowing that a fine is not going to be able to be paid or is not going to be as motivating. But I just wanted to point that out, that some cities have gone that way. And I think that is, for all the reasons I think we all in this room probably agree on, is not helpful in any way. And I don't even want to see it as an option.
A few thoughts around listening to Ian and talking about fines and things around how this is sort of an example of what I was talking about at the very beginning around my value of wanting to use differently, which is like, so we have to put it in there because that's what we do and that's what we've done, right? And so what we've always done is actually a really dangerous sentence because it creates institutional oppression that gets carried on for generations. So if we can lean into, okay, this is what it's always been done, but maybe we don't have to put it in, or we can put it in a different way. And I appreciate, a court process that offer support that people may or may not consent to. And then my other thought was, I want to circle back to what Cheyenne said, because there's been a lot of hubbub about the role and you, and people are stoked, and that's fantastic. And it's just not lost on me that the person we've been waiting for has said the best practice is to create places for people to go. And we have not done that. And until we do that, I don't think we can keep diving into this. Because the best practice, and our expert that we all hired that we're stoked on, is saying, this is the best practice. And it takes longer, but that is the best practice. So let's follow the best practice and create that first, because it reduces harm, increases safety, and does so many things. And then let's go from there.
So I want to turn to Cheyenne, but I do want to also acknowledge that Cheyenne also told us there's never going to be enough shelter, which is part of why she was recommending taking that piece out. So I don't want to speak for you, but I'd love to hear your thoughts, right? Because you've been in communities that have different types of codes, and I would love to hear, your thoughts on the value of having these types of rules at all and how that can dovetail with then creating those spaces and all that other stuff. Yeah.
Thank you. I want to offer a couple of things, and I really just meant to consider that no community has this figured out. It's hard because there's no best practice to look at. There are better practices. There's no one best practice. The communities that are more successful than others have a wide toolkit, and they're using all the tools. So I think to your point about, doing both. Yeah, it's okay to have tools. it doesn't mean you use them all. You don't use a hammer for every situation. I generally will recommend policy that leans towards supporting vulnerable people to be less vulnerable and not supporting large institutions or angry community members, neighbors to have a weaponized code, right? That's generally how I'm going to land. I want to step back a little bit and offer a different way to look at all of this, which might just be helpful because this feels difficult because this is not quite the tool. This is one tool, right? So everyone has mentioned all these other tools, right? So I would highly encourage that you look at a toolkit approach rather than this being the tool. It can feel uncomfortable to commit to one tool without the others.
Right, yeah, it just feels lacking. It feels like we're really creating a wound by not.
You're starting with the hammer.
Yeah, it's like, let's start with the nurturing.
So let me just finish with that point, which is that what we are talking about when we talk about houselessness is in some ways a function of the housing market and affordable housing. The other way that I would encourage people to look at it is a public health crisis. And so when we look for best practices, one of the best ways to look is not towards this type of tool. It is towards public health tools. And those are rooted in dismantling, historic marginalization of community members who have experienced the trauma of poverty, the trauma of discrimination. We are not trying to replicate what we've been doing. It hasn't worked. We know that. That's why we're here. So there is this opportunity, I think, in front of this city you will probably not have the best practice. There are probably no best practices. What you are faced with is dealing with poverty and public health issues and disabilities and the housing market. And that's too complex for this people. What you can do, though, is try to address this in more of a public health approach, which is proactive, peer-driven, trauma-informed, cultural competent. You have all those in your language already. I hear many of you using that. So you have an opportunity to take a public health stance. That can be helpful as you build tools like this because they are much more, let's provide lots of opportunities for engagement, not weaponized code that can be used to arrest people, which obviously is not the right tool. And I realize that's not a specific recommendation. It's just a different way to look at what we're looking at that probably feels a little bit more comfortable. Thank you for summing that up.
And I don't want to minimize this effort, but I do see it as kind of the last tool we're implementing in this toolbox, in this biennium. And I know nobody intends to, but the massive amount of work that this council and city staff have invested in a very specifically targeted approach, which thank God you're part of it. Like the idea that, this is a standalone effort to fix homelessness, everybody should understand that's not what we're doing here tonight. And again, I don't want to minimize this regulatory legislative activity because it's super important. I don't think it matters at all when you look at one life saved by a bed in Division Street, or the acquisition of the Rainbow, or the massive investment that the city made through ARPA in exactly what we're talking about, which is services delivered directly to the people who need them the most. So I agree with everything you're saying. We have to treat this as a public health approach. Even survival shelter regulation has to be treated as a public health. We have to look at it through the public health lens. But this is also a very small piece of a massive effort undertaken by the city to do exactly what we've just described. And I know like our code language is woefully inadequate to address the regional, national, state public health crisis that is homelessness. Even the tools we have as we sit around the table and try to talk about what are the tools we have to actually, I agree you want it to be voluntary, but we have to regulate public space, and there are so few tools to encourage compliance. And I acknowledge we are extremely limited in that. But I also don't want to discount the work that city staff, county staff, and this entire community of essentially volunteers have done to try to save lives. And we've made from the people who are struggling, who are unhoused, to the housed community who's doing everything they can to make sure this is an equitable, egalitarian community. I struggle with having to regulate public space, but it's in the larger context.
I think it's very important. I think one way you can approach it is to focus on nuisance behaviors, because those are less related to survival sheltering and more related to what I think anyone would describe as truly disruptive to the public peace. Blocking sidewalks if someone can't walk to their camp or, to their shelter. There are so many nuisance behaviors that you can define. And then you can take the public health approach of, is this a behavioral health issue? Can someone actually comply with, are they hoarding and cluttering out in the public eye? And it looks like they're littering and breaking laws, but actually they're unable to self-regulate and manage those. They need a behavioral health. That's the tool we use.
Right.
It is hard to add that to city code. However, you've gone this step of, the procedure for an enforcement personnel and calling the shelter. I would encourage that rather than looking for a bed in the middle of the night, you're looking to engage someone in the appropriate services, and consistent engagement and trust building is really the tool that does work. So,
and I think at least my expectation is, we're not making any decisions tonight, but we have had conversations at council about the implementing instrument. So there will be further work outside of the code that I think describes exactly what you're talking about. I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think there's been uniform position over every meeting we've had on this, that the first person making contact, the second person making contact, maybe even the third person making contact should never be law enforcement. It doesn't work and it's counterproductive. We need really county behavioral and public health to be, if it's not a service provider, to be the face of this entire community, lifting up people who are struggling. I do see that as I think we've talked in council. I don't think we've decided on this. I do see that as critical to the enforcement instrument if we have a code that's in place.
have those conversations with county behavioral health happen to make sure that there's not an assumption of.
While you're here.
Yeah, exactly. I'm happy to help.
Yeah, and on Thursday, we'll also have county
County
behavioral
West.
health in that space. I see a lot of people who are still wanting to dive in, and I don't want to totally kind of sidetrack the conversation that we're having. I think is really valuable. I do want to do a time check that it's 7 and we have until 7:30 of everybody's time here tonight. And I'm curious to dig into a little bit of, if this is a tool that the city is considering in the toolbox, then are there aspects of this that are especially either problematic or important? If we're looking at, as you referred to, Cheyenne, nuisance behavior, that I'm also curious about behaviors or activities that are problematic or dangerous specifically for other people who are sheltering outside. That like one, if there are several people in the same area who are living outside, and one person and one person is engaging in certain behavior that is making others unsafe, uncomfortable. Like, are there things on this list that we should especially be kind of looking at? Like, this is an important aspect to, this is an important thing to regulate. Or it's a problematic thing that should definitely not be in there. We definitely want to hear kind of both.
Ian just popped up. I don't know if that was on purpose.
Oh, not you, Ian, like there's there now, that Ian Schmidt. Yes, and Zoom people, please feel free to unmute or raise your hand, get our attention in any way that you need to.
In terms of that nuisance component, I think that's maybe there's some sort of definition or language that gets added into the camping code that talks about that.
That a lot of that would be under the manner section.
Yeah.
It's, not dumping gray water, not tapping into electrical. I don't want anybody doing that.
Yeah.
I was
If
gonna
you're
say, these are
sheltering-
actually probably somewhere else.
Yeah, this is,
Recreate.
well, this was, the idea was to put them all in one place because they're in many different places, all in one place, so that it's very clear, like kind of what the list you go down. But yeah, I think that's where that nuisance behavior is talked about, whether that needs to change or be adjusted or whatever else is absolutely for discussion.
Does the city have data about calls for service and constituent complaints that would give us some information about how to address? I mean, because I think that's a good source of information. What is a problem?
Mhm.
Okay,
Mhm.
so this is informed by.
Yeah, we have a lot.
I mean, and this is, we have to acknowledge the fact that there are crimes that get committed, the police respond to. This isn't going to change that. People are committing crimes.
That's different. Yeah, yeah.
Ian has his.
Thank you. Go ahead, Ian Schmidt. Not Ian, like I said. Yeah, you can unmute, yeah. Make sure you unmute yourself first.
And
Yeah, go ahead.
Am I unmuted now?
Yes.
Great. So the Affordable Housing Committee has not taken a strong position on this. There's no consensus, but this feels like the right place in the conversation, given the conversation that has been going on, that the Affordable Housing Committee strongly feels that the best, clearest approach to addressing this problem is to continue to produce housing and support others to produce housing in our community. I think there are many methods by which the city has been doing that, working with partners, and the AHAC has really appreciated that support. But I will echo what I've heard several other folks say recently, and that best practice is housing. Best practice is providing our neighbors places to live that are dignifying and places that they will want to be and they'll want to feel safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Ian. We had a kind of presentation at the beginning talking about all the different tools in the toolkit. Do we know exactly how much money the city of Bend is currently investing in supporting unsanctioned survival sheltering? Is there any funds?
About 500,000 is what I think was on that sheet.
That was including cleanup.
Cleanup efforts and, resourcing for garbage, porta potty, rentals, things like that.
And do we know for like 5,000 a year or
100,000.
no, 500,000?
500,000 in total. That's kind of summarizing a lot of that activity that has been over the past 2 years right now.
So about 100,000 a year?
More like 200,000 to 300,000 a year.
Okay, my math is really bad. I am so sorry. So would it be cheaper if the city of Bend allocates Troy Field and other areas to have ongoing trash pickup and services as opposed to these kind of
We have
random?
some of that, right? At East Road, we have, that's what we've been doing, of providing resources there. But it's been in combination with also making sure that we have a accessible right of way, so we don't have folks blocking, or we have debris, creating safety issues. So we are actively monitoring, both monitoring as well as resourcing that as an area.
And one last question. So Hunnell Road is an example of where people are sheltering unsanctioned and they're receiving support from the city with cleaning and whatnot. Do those folks feel like they're stable there for now, or do you know if they feel like they're going to be pushed out at any moment?
But that's a unique situation because there's a construction project that is being led by the county that is kind of on the horizon. So I would say no, I don't think people feel safe and secure there knowing that that project is coming.
Last question, and I promise I'll shut up. Do we have any funds that we're allocating for unsanctioned sheltering that it's going to areas where people can be there stable?
That's really the intent of Safe Park. So we have money going towards REACH, which then manages safe parking sites. And
Or you gotta have a car?
No.
No. No. So yeah, we do resource that.
Yeah.
Okay, all right, sorry, threw me off. Good to know.
Yeah, I want some so the safe parking code says that I can go there with my gear, my setup without a car.
Yes.
And how many areas in the community are there for that?
So far, we've got 4 sites.
And
We aren't always, we're trying to reach.
up to 6 spots. That's
Six
what the code
spots.
says.
Six, basically,
Up to
like
6 parking spots, basically.
sheltering spots
Yeah.
per site.
Yeah.
What's the math? Can someone-
24.
We love there to be more.
Another sites at 6. I mean, some have 3, some have 4, so it's a variety, but it is allowed, the code allows for up to 6.
And we have been tremendously successful with people graduating. Dawn's house in particular, I called her up the other day and I had no idea. It's dozens of people that have been
Move
able,
through their
yes,
trailers,
that
yeah.
they graduate, which means they're now in permanent stable housing. It's a shockingly small number, especially when you consider that we have more than 80 churches in our city, and churches are tax exempt. They pay no taxes whatsoever. Many.
But then, Barb, my taxes that go to Parks and Recs to parks on the west side that I will never use.
Amen, sister. Could we, I'm sorry, this will get onto the news. Here's a question for the news. Does eminent domain work against other public agencies? Could we just condemn and take over some of the parks?
No.
Well, there was a loud definitive no. Honestly, Joanne, I genuinely believe you have identified, this catch-22. When we released to the community a map of a property that we, the city, own, it caused so much upset because it showed very clearly that we own very little property except for Juniper Ridge. And the property we own is right in the neighborhood. It is associated with our water facilities. People thought that map meant there's going to be a camp, and it just caused so much upset. But it showed so clearly how a city that does not control parks, how little property might be held by that city. So Medford, for example, has tried to use all of the land that they have for parks to allow people to have survival shelter in those parks. And we just don't have that opportunity now that I know we can't eminent domain on parks
We
land.
can work with our Parks Board
Of
partners
course
and
we
maybe not antagonize them and try to bring them to the table to talk about it.
Of course, yes.
Can I just answer Joanne's question really quick? And then maybe I can turn it over to you, Cheyenne. Is that okay, Mayor? So I want to go back to the earlier, I think the money is really important. The funding is really important. I think it shows you where our values are. And I just want to outline again, the $19 million we spent in this biennium for houselessness services and support and meaningful, not just trash pickup, which is a Band-Aid, but important. But let's remember that we've spent $13.1 million on shelter acquisition and renovation, $3.8 million on shelter operations, $1.7 million on temporary outdoor shelter, and then the $500,000 on right-of-way cleanup and other support. So I hope that the community sees collective effort that we're putting our very finite resources. Most of our resources are tied up in general fund obligated areas. We've spent significant dollars, including significant ARPA dollars, on solutions that actually work and aren't, maybe what everybody is clamoring for us to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that that's where we stand different, right? Where we are leading, where we're showing to our community that we can create new things, that we can, take a new path that will give us different results. But then not everybody, we're making the assumption that people want to be in a program and want to be in a shelter. When I was having a conversation with some of the folks here about the questionnaire that the city is asking folks, there are so many implicit assumptions that there's no way we can actually get a reliable feedback from community member if we're already telling them, how do you feel between sunrise and sunset? Does that work for you? Because that's what we're envisioning. So I encourage all of us to kind of take a step back, ground, and what are the values, right? I'm very clear, mine is justice. I want to see justice for the folks that are living in injustice. And I think that that will help us weed out everything that does not align with those core values. So then actually have a plan that everyone can be proud of and community members will be in buy-in.
I think there's been some scope creep around the policy and programming and funding. And so I love it because there is this idea of connections to the broader toolkit. And I think there are conversations that we should continue. And I'm happy to support a convening of partners to look holistically at the amount of resources the overall community has, whether it's county land or district land. I think those are really helpful conversations, and I think there's a way to have them, and I'm happy to, the office to support those. I think in terms of this code, I do think it is important to have in the toolkit because, to your point around clarity, if people don't have it, then there is no clarity, and you end up with high friction, fear, tension, complaints, concerns, and you spend a huge amount of operational burden of the city sort of accidentally not responding or responding to that. I would encourage that you think about how this actually plays out in practice. And one of the ways that I've seen communities struggle with codes like this is that once there is clarity, people self-assign themselves to be the enforcers of this. So one option I think you might consider is to have an encampment resolution strategy and call line so that rather than people calling everyone, there's a single place to call and make a concern, concerned neighbor, be able to voice whatever that is a nuisance behavior, describe what's happening, get in more information about the code or about the resources available. Often I hear from neighbors who just don't know where they can refer someone. I'm concerned about my neighbor who's living outside. It's getting cold. How do I help them? They don't know. So connecting to the existing system of care and doing that explicitly in this code, I think is helpful both for the either formal or informal enforcers, also for the service providers to build in that expectation that there will be an appropriate tool offered. I think that will address a huge amount of the friction and sort of angst that you're hearing and not having something. I do recommend that you have something. So even though it's uncomfortable, I think you can have a tool that balances all of that and channels it towards solutions that actually are proven to work. That is, a lot of communities have that. I think it's very effective.
Yeah. I was just going to say that Cheyenne I feel like you just encapsulated, like the first part of what you said encapsulated like the current state of affairs of like the friction. And, it's like, it's very, it's very kind of all consuming for us as a body, for us as a city. And it's not something that is in the city's kind of traditional toolkit. So I think that's what brings us to, these types of discussions where we're kind of going, okay, everybody, like, we think we need a tool here. What does that tool need to do for us? And how can we most effectively, slip that tool into the toolkit with the rest of them?
So Cheyenne, to that effect, the Human Rights and Equity Commission did have a vote, a consensus vote, unanimous vote, to recommend that the city does not criminalize houselessness, but that rather puts the responsibility on the institution to provide safe spaces for people to then have somewhere to go. So that's all that they're pondering right now.
And I, like I said before, I think good policy comes from a certain degree of that conflict, healthy friction. And I think that, that can be true. And we can have a way of navigating what can become very difficult encampment settings like Hunnell Road that is becoming unsafe for its residents. No one, I think, wants this code to, or a lack of code to encourage very large encampments that we know become unsafe for people with disabilities, women, folks who are more vulnerable, become less safe in those spaces. So there are ways to support camps to be safe spaces for their residents. And I am happy to lend resources to ensure that best practices are being approached. And I fully agree with what you're saying around safe parking spaces. Many of them, creating places that people can get access to services is really appropriate for a community this size.
I see Morgan's hand up.
Thanks, Joanne, reminding me that I should offer the limited feedback that I did hear from some of our NLA reps. There were concerns cited around enforcement, but I think we've had a lot of good conversation around that tonight. And, speaking as myself, a strong desire for whatever tools we implement, not to criminalize those who are doing their best to survive here. The other two items that were brought to my attention are, kind of a constant concern around proximity to schools of folks who are sheltering, and then also this is a more recent one, just consideration for residential areas that abut commercial zones, and what does that line kind of tend to look like for those that might back up to a business or motel, and so. That's what I've heard from NLA. For me, I'm just really grateful for this conversation, for the spirit I think that this group is engaging in with a real view towards how do we care for our neighbors, how do we look at dignifying options, and how do we look at continuing to look for ways to keep this from becoming a tool to that would cause more harm, and how do we look at it as a tool of connecting people to further resources and best practices that will actually get at some of the root causes of what people are experiencing and help them get in more stable situations. And so I'm really grateful for the dialogue, and I think can wholeheartedly say, in the grand scheme of things, I think what the NLA would love to see is a world in which people don't have to camp on our streets or in our forests, and whatever tools get us there. I think I really appreciate these kinds of thoughtful conversations around. So thank you.
Ben? Well, I think you had something, but I kind of cut you off, and I'm sorry.
Okay. One thought I'm noticing is, this is bureaucracy in government. As in city council, we were like, hey, let's figure out this code. And so the lawyers really went to work. So thank you, lawyers and staff, for going to work. But it's not lost to me that Cheyenne's expertise and wisdom is, even in this hour and a half, has been really clarifying, I think, for folks. Mm-hmm. And so I can imagine okay, taking this feedback and then saying, hey, lawyer crew, go do this, is actually limited in a way, just because lawyers have a different specialty than Cheyenne does. And so what would it be like to get you in a room with the legal team to create this code in a more simplified, best practice, trauma-informed way that comes, not to say that if you practice law that you're a hammer, I'm not saying that, but it's a certain way of thinking and a certain education and specialty. Of course, is different. And so how do we create that so that we can create a code that's sort of aiming at what you've been bringing to the table? Because the way I read some of the code, it's not. And so that it needs to be different. And so how to be efficient about how to write that and make that happen is having that thought.
That's part of the point of tonight is at least to start that.
Yep. Yeah.
And to try to take this legal document and start to infuse it with some of this feedback. So recognizing that we have 10 minutes left, I see people leaning and wanting to
say that. I think, my thought is that we take tonight, we take Thursday, and that's what we talk about on October 5th at our work session is, okay, here's what we have. Yeah. So now where do we go from there? And I think, so that's why I'm kind of withholding on next steps right now, because I'm anxious to hear what we hear on Thursday too, you know, and kind of go from there.
Well,
That's my.
Mhm.
and I am happy to join a conversation. This is my second week, and so I just landed here at the table. Yeah, but I have gone through this, and I can certainly provide some information that will, I think, help inform some of the decisions you have, you know, as policymakers. I think that's a way that the office can be helpful and supportive to this process, is to provide examples of best practices or better practices, and offer, you know, things to consider without probably going so far as making specific policy recommendations, but happy to help support the process.
And on that note, just to follow on Mo's point, the Human Rights and Equity Commission will have a template that we can start using so that the process of embedding equity is not something that happens 3 or 4 steps down the road, but that is embedded from conception to evaluation.
So with our remaining time, I do, even though we've been, you know, fairly high level, and I really appreciate that, I also want to make sure that if anyone has any feedback on the specific like sections of the code that we haven't gotten to, that we have an opportunity just to at least consider, if, you know, recognizing that all of these are subject to kind of change and manipulation as we go through the process. Is there anything that stood out to you that is like, this is really problematic, this is important, or questions around the time, place, and manner regulation specifically, or those related to vehicles?
I think you'll likely run into some trickiness around the term established, like what that actually means. The definition itself doesn't define this. It sort of talks about what it is.
Talked about that as being problematic.
Yeah.
It's a difficult question, yeah.
I just think that that is worth defining if you're going to have it in there. I think there's, you know, in terms of best practices, moving people along frequently is not a best practice. And the reason is it makes it very difficult for service providers to continue building trust and connecting with someone. And if they go back to a camp to provide the support and outreach and they're not there, then they go into the wind and you lose that contact. So it's not to say that I'm encouraging entrenched encampments in inappropriate places so much as balancing what we say is established and what the nuisance there is. Like, what is the societal problem we're trying to address? Is it that the camp has now become actually many people? You know, because this also doesn't address this issue of how large a total encampment is. It talks about 12 by 12 for an individual. But if there's 100 of those in our school, then we're actually, so playing it out and deciding, well, what are we trying to work against? Something around larger encampments, or you know, how many of one type of camp we're seeing.
I can share my screen. What I've been doing is trying to summarize what I heard today so that we all walk out of here feeling like that.
Someone took notes.
I was taking notes.
I took notes, but I can't.
I'm like, what does that mean? What I just said?
See if there's any gaps, if that works.
I think that'd be great.
Yeah, I can do that. Sure, because you're the host, I can email it to you.
Yeah, that's great.
And they're a little critical, so again, just like doing lots of acronyms and stuff, just. I know, I tried not to do a lot of that.
More acronyms, not sure.
But they're your acronyms. So the only acronyms I'm using is like
I've already chastised.
CRO, HREC, acronyms of the committee.
I've been here long enough to know them.
Yeah.
What I'll do is, while Shelley is putting that up, I'll just kind of read them to you. And then you'll see them visually on the screen. So I heard kind of in the category of process and general feedback that consider removing shelter availability from the context of the code until there's sufficient shelter. and more on this sort of service-oriented sort of approach. And that was kind of coming both from, I said CRO, kind of the collaborative, or the acronym of your office. Yeah. Coordinated Response
CHRO.
Office. Yes.
Response office.
And same thing with the Human Rights and Equity Commission. I think there's some alignment there. The need to focus on where people can go in concert with the code development, kind of again, some alignment with the CRO, the HRC, engagement in services versus an enforcement approach. And the potential solution of the coordinated office being kind of involved in maybe looking at back and best practices and using into code. On the definition section, to kind of go back kind of each category that you're discussing around defining accessibility in the code more intently. The seeing sheltering as a human rights, that's something that the Human Rights and Equity Commission has brought up. This change camping to survival sheltering as a change in that definition. Maybe what is the question mark about what does established mean? Focus. Time feedback, we heard the potential problematic of requiring people to remove materials, camps, et cetera, in the coldest part of the day. On place feedback from the NLA, we heard concern around proximity to schools as well as residential areas that abut commercial zones. Just the focus of nuisance behavior in the matter section probably is there, but if there's something missing on sort of behavior, that's probably where it belongs. On supports, resources needed, this idea of not really wanting to put like a fine or fee schedule and use alternative mechanisms, which we've begun to explore, but more attention there. And then we heard from the Affordable Housing Advisory Committee about the connection, which is a real one of housing efforts.
Did you put this statement about like kind of the size of encampments?
Yeah, I was just about to say the number of people.
Maybe that's under manner or something.
Okay, no, I missed
Yeah.
that. So thank
Yeah,
you.
just like
Okay.
looking through my draft code to find that spot, but basically considering, size of overall encampment and not just size of individual.
Yeah, but the larger.
How do we kind of
So
engage?
I'm capturing it. We just don't have the ability
Yeah.
to have it live. So, okay.
And one other thing that was probably implied more than stated is this idea of making this code cohesive and not siloed or disconnected or even in conflict with other programs and policies. There's, I think, a cohesion check that sometimes attorneys will do with other code sections, but also with the programs and funded, those are other places that values show up, and ensuring that the values expressed here and the tool is cohesive to the entire toolkit, and that you're not creating more confusion, but you're creating some clarity, and that there's true, synthesis and syncing between what we're doing practically in programs and what we're saying, in terms of policy. I think it's just a helpful practice generally for new.
Capture that. And then, did I miss anything?
Did you say survival sheltering?
Yeah.
We also talked, or I talked about the idea of having an overall encampment resolution strategy and a number to call.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
I have that. So if you scroll down, it was the last thing that I just didn't think
Okay.
to cover. I said encampment resolution strategy, connecting the existing system of care on formal and informal enforcers and channels for solutions. Generally, I mean, maybe that word for word.
Yep, that's what I heard too.
I'll put that in there.
Yeah, but like single point of contact or something like
Okay.
that. Yeah.
Or anything that I might have missed, or you want to say that you didn't capture that correctly? I know there's other folks capturing notes here too, so we can kind of cross-reference.
Yeah, that's
I want to make
important.
sure I
Yeah.
have the headlines.
Mhm.
Great.
I would just love to see need focus on where people can go. To state, I think that the request is the accountability piece, right? Like, are we going to provide the spaces? And what is the city committing to with this code? Because we are asking on house neighbors to commit to not be here or not be there from this time to this time or whatever. So I wonder if we should include also what the city is committing to to meet folks halfway.
I think certainly providing information, so rather than, an enforcement officer or personnel, going to make a bunch of calls to shelters to find a bed, instead providing a list, of options and support resources. And that could include all the safe parking spaces, which we know are not just parking. That should probably get communicated. You don't need to have a car. If someone's in a tent, they most likely. And potentially a safe way to get there. Because if they don't have that, then a place that's too far for them to walk, especially if they do have disabilities, will be inaccessible. So offering a range of options and commitments to back those, I think is
Yeah, and to that disability standpoint too, is some houseless individuals need funds, whether it be through the state or through federal funds, and being able to access those places where they need to fill out the applications, pick up their checks and stuff too. So.
Right. I'm sensing that we're out of energy as much as possible here. Thank you again, everybody, for your engagement in this discussion. This has been really helpful. We're a little bit of a small group tonight, but I really appreciated the opportunity to have this discussion with you all. And let's keep it going. Next steps are, as I said, that we will review all of this feedback on October 5th. We're going to have pretty much our entire work session devoted to that next Wednesday. And then we will also have kind of ongoing topics on our work session agendas for the next couple of months. And we have our roundtable coming up on Thursday, which is going to be a packed one. That one is not here. That one is at the county building from 10 to noon. And as always, community members can email us and visit the website for more information. So thank you again for giving us a large portion of your evening, and good night.
Thank you for the example of collaborative governance.
Yeah.
Welcome. Thanks for going with us on this adventure.
I actually was talking to folks at City of Portland, telling them we do round tables and open houses